So welcome back to the hot house. We've placed some new people in the hot seats over here, who, as you will recall from yesterday, we also have invited respondents to kind of critically deconstruct everything we've tried to say. And we'll have a response to each of the two panels of today, and from that, a general discussion, I think, among us all. And we will do it in the order of the panels. So first, Laura McLean will talk about the panel this morning, respond to that panel, and also, I think, to general questions. And then Ben Fallon will try to respond to the second panel, or third panel of today. And we'll just do it one after the other and then have the discussion, I think. So,
okay,
Laura.
Can you hear me fine? Okay. So if you hark your minds back to this morning and conversations about survival through an economic and environmental lens, I'll start with my thoughts on these discussions. Catherine, and in order of presenters, and then maybe summing up a little, I thought the conversation by Catherine was good after Andrea's talk yesterday on the labour of deprivatising institutions for reintroducing conversations around the labour of commoning. She talked about the work of creating community not by creating sameness, that is subsuming difference, but rather creating togetherness. And this thematic of fostering diversity runs throughout discussions of ecology throughout. And she talked about creating new human subjects or more than human subjects. And this kind of inclusive, expansive approach, I think, is highly necessary in the Anthropocene era. And I'm going to use that term as shorthand in the awareness, of course, that it is still anthropocentric and totalising. TJ considered Bolivia and Ecuador and the rights of nature, and the issue of expanded rights, I think, is important to consider regarding the human as well. We're in a moment when boundaries and thresholds of many kinds are being broken, and the expansion of human rights, taking into account increasing subjectivities that are constituted beyond the nation state, are important to this. And in this threshold, moving into rights of humans rather than moving beyond the human, which is a proposition in some recent discourses, I think is important. Catherine touched on the infrastructure of the internet as well, discussing the wires and the server farms that hold our data, which are real and material, and of course consuming a huge amount of energy and pump out heat into the atmosphere, thereby contributing to our warming world. This is real infrastructure, but these are also virtual spaces that we inhabit, at least in the developed world, as much as we inhabit the material, the ground, I suppose, the ground that we can situate ourselves on. Of course, we can't upload ourselves, we're still here, but I think these conversations about always being online and this increased pressure shows how much we are affected by this realm. And in that we put all of our creative effort, in a sense, or much of our creative effort, into constituting this space, I think the discussion of social relationships around property are important to this. What commons are we creating online, and how can we prevent them from being ensconced by corporations? I think we often don't consider, maybe in this room and people do, but in the broader sense, people don't consider where the commons are being constituted in this space. Somehow this reminded me of, and a lot of this has to do with Facebook, we'll just use that as a good example. I think it's still a very useful space, but we have to be aware of what infrastructure is within. And I was reminded of a conversation yesterday that is a good example of how this is a useful space socially, but then we still have to go beyond it. The issue of the Sydney Biennale came up, and the whole controversy around that earlier this year was that Transfield are sponsoring the Biennale. They established it, or helped establish it, and they've always funded it to a great extent. But the controversy was, for those who aren't aware, that they are also making money from the detention centres that Australia runs in islands around the continent as well as on the continent. This became apparent to artists who are participating, and a meeting was called to discuss this. And I know the Zanny Beg, who organised the first meeting, and then went from there. She didn't create the whole thing, but she's an organiser. But I saw this entire thing unfold on Facebook, and then saw the media outlet come, and this all fed back into this social space. So while it was something that was happening IRL in real life, it was also organised through this space. So I thought that was something interesting to consider. So Catherine went on to consider a bit how Australia has suffered little from the financial crisis. It's dug up its resources to create wealth, and is in a relatively prosperous position, although it has minor debt compared to the rest of the world. But the current right-wing government have created the conditions of austerity that are not necessary. I think everyone I know is still grappling with the kind of devastating impact of having all of this put on at once. The budget is quite extremely austere in contrast, and there has been huge outrage and uprising, which I think is interesting. I asked her this morning if perhaps this is a condition that intellectuals, I suppose, might take as an opportunity to think through this kind of sudden plonking down of the hard conditions of neoliberalism. And while I think it is perhaps a chance for people to utilise the knowledge and ability that they have, but I think it's also that's also optimistic. As I think an audience member brought up, perhaps the conditions or the readiness isn't quite there. So we'll see how that goes. So TJ went on to discuss indigeneity, which returned to this issue of fostering diversity. And I think while this issue is good, there was a slippage in language there, which also highlighted the problematic of potential co-option in this idea. Indigeneity is not about othering, but about developing forms of solidarity, as he defended, for instance, the Zapatistas, local identity being retained while operating globally, or being identified globally. But TJ also used the term becoming Indigenous, which is not the same as solidarity. It's solidarity is standing by, it's not joining or becoming, which I think is how this issue of co-option became a point of discussion and is something to be aware of. I think the same audience member I mentioned before found a problem in going towards discussions of Indigenous knowledge rather than practice, which again might be a valid wariness, especially with regards to Australian Indigenous knowledge. It reminds me of an example from a presentation a while ago, where someone gave the example of land management, that Indigenous people with the knowledge of backburning, where you burn back the land in order to regenerate the trees, the grass, in order to grow food and to protect from bushfire, that's a localised knowledge, and it is still practiced, but it's being used by government where they'll take someone from one area to another and go, okay, you can use your knowledge here now, but it's in an entirely different location. It's trying to use the knowledge without the practice, I suppose, I'll put it that way. I was also just thinking about the anomaly of Australia as far as this east-west, north-south conversation. It never seems to fit in anywhere, but conversations later about post-coloniality were useful there. And so that kind of fits well, segueing into Maya and Ruben's positioning of the 1989 moment as one of lost opportunity for instituting care of nature in a global sense. I think, of course, this end of history was the beginning of the end for the world in terms of climate, when the conditions for radically accelerated global trade, development and carbon output were created, but it led to the truly globalising condition of global warming. And amongst news, as well as the Australian budget announced this week, was the announcement of the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Just thinking here in terms of conversations of contingency, which I might come back to. I've been doing some work lately that's been looking at, it's come at, I was looking at Grotius, who was from the Netherlands, who worked for the Dutch East India Company, and his text, Mer Liberum, argued for global trade, arguing for like the freedom of the seas. So it was a kind of, it opened the way to liberalism. And interestingly, with a little bit of research beforehand, I realised that this had come from a situation where in the Netherlands, flooding had created conditions where people were not able to grow food, and therefore trade was sought. And now in current conditions, sea levels are rising, and this becomes, again, this issue which Marina picked up a little bit on, about issues of disparity in crisis. In the case of the West Antarctic ice sheet collapse and subsequent 10 feet level rise, the Netherlands have the technology and the wealth and the knowledge to protect themselves, perhaps, in the future from devastation, socially, economically, from this. I've been looking at islands that are not necessarily prosperous and do not necessarily have the technology to defend against this, as well as perhaps Bangladesh or any less developed country. And so there, I think these issues of the disparity of the effects of crisis can be felt and considered in that kind of lineage of cause and effect and economy. And so maybe I'll just kind of end a little bit here on this mention of Marina's on the logic of sacrifice, which he talked about as a way to think debt, austerity, and species loss, that perhaps we're making a former Earth, but I think we're also, if thinking in terms of sacrifice, we're sacrificing not necessarily other humans, but other humans' ability to live rather than survive. And maybe I'll just return to this point on contingency and then pass over to you. Boris was talking about contingency, said the idea had moved to the past when there was political potential. And I think that now we are subject to the contingency of the world that we have created. It is creating the new, or rather we've created the conditions that we inhabit, and that the politics in the future will have to respond to this rather than perhaps have the potential in themselves to move forward in various ways. So it's a very dark ending, but maybe you can go on from there.
Well, maybe I'll kind of mumble through some thoughts. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me, or maybe not, because I'm going to have to try and deal with this kind of very slippery idea of the post. Just on a kind of, I mean, I was invited to do this last week, and I've kind of been thinking about it, kind of getting quite anxious, trying to kind of work out, what is the post, and I'm nowhere near any kind of answer on it, to be honest. But I think maybe I'll talk a little bit about anxiety and kind of how this relates to some of the talks, and kind of how maybe anxiety relates to this idea of post and positive and negative modes of anxiety. Now, first of all, Boris brought up the idea of kind of being, well, Fukuyama's idea of kind of being at the end of history, and kind of saying we're not, which I'm just not sure. I'm not sure I'm convinced by a reboot of history. What I see maybe is a reboot of kind of history as an object of kind of cultural heritage, kind of coming back and haunting us, maybe through the commons relationship to religion, and these kind of maybe flattened images, which are maybe what Rosa talks about in the idea of crystallization, or what Jameson. I mean, when I heard that, I mean, Jameson writes about this in I can never say the word antinomies of the modern in 1977, I think. I'm probably very wrong on that. And he kind of, effectively says postmodernity is, an unprecedented rate of change, but nothing really changing. And I tend to agree, and maybe we've reached this moment of kind of a naturalised postmodernity where it's just our kind of condition, so it's not something which we can look at and kind of analyse as an object, which is maybe why it's passé. I mean, I'm probably going to be shot down for that, but that's fine. And so I'm going to move on to Alexei, and kind of what he was talking about with the idea of sleep and time, and kind of I have a lot of sympathy and a lot of agreement with everything that Alexei said, but then maybe a kind of a very central disagreement, which kind of comes through from Brigitte's talk, that I don't think we're living in a time of no time. I think we're living in a time of kind of thousands of times, a kind of real intensification of the number of times that we're kind of existing in. And this, I think, would relate to, you know, our year of 1989. The post-historical moment is the same year that the World Wide Web comes into being. So it's in March of 1989 that it's kind of shown to the world, first of all, which kind of means there's a popular access to the internet. The internet, of course, exists for a long time before this. And kind of how that has brought about a kind of an acceleration of modes of working, kind of ways of working, and with it a kind of anxiety, which kind of came through in the questions where we're talking about emails, probably one of the worst inventions of all time. I mean, interestingly, the Queen was the first person in the UK to have an email address, something I discovered recently. And I mean, I like this idea of procrastination. I think it's something we've maybe lost in this thing. Procrastination to me maybe denotes more of a kind of dilated sense of time, you know, a time where you're kind of thinking, as opposed to the kind of, you know, the captured time of procrastination now is Facebook, you know, when you're kind of working through something, it's now, or maybe you do procrastinate, maybe it is kind of easy to then go to Facebook and kind of, you know, if there's a knot in your thinking, you don't sit and kind of push through it, or I don't, certainly. And I kind of, I wonder about if we could recapture that time. I don't think that's a good idea, but you know, I don't know. It's actually, maybe I'm thinking that, you know, no time is the time that we want. It's not actually this time of kind of contemporaneity that we have now. And I think that that's maybe where I disagree with the analysis, is that you know, it is a kind of more, I mean, this horrible word of kind of a psychedelic time, where we can think differently, where we can think beyond a post. And I'm not sure if we have it now. Sorry. Sorry, I'm also kind of a bit sleep deprived because we're kind of living under this condition. I'm very hot, kind of tired, and also a very kind of accelerated kind of response rate. And then, so, I mean, I guess actually I'm going to go back to this kind of question of anxiety. And so this kind of came out in the question where Boris brought up the idea of, like, Fukuyama saying that, you know, what's coming is the age of boredom and a kind of nostalgia for history and so on. And I kind of think he's wrong. I think, you know, what is coming is the age of anxiety. There's a great text by We Are Plan C, who are a kind of group of people thinking in Leeds and Manchester at the moment, which kind of analyses anxiety as a kind of predominant affect of kind of our moment. So we've moved from the boredom of Fordism to this kind of perpetual anxiety. And I don't know if I can kind of, obviously I'm showing that I can't kind of work through this properly at the moment, but I kind of feel like there's something important to try and like link the idea of the post with the anxiety, which I can't do. But then I'm going to ask kind of one final question, kind of like how the post relates to the former, which I think is kind of something really quite important. You know, it's the title of Former West, but we talk about post, but not former. I mean, simply we could think that they're the same words, but I don't think that they are. I think that the post kind of holds still a referent to something, whereas the former is something which kind of no longer exists. And I mean, and I wonder maybe if Maria could say something about this in relationship to this quote from Gramsci about the old world being dead, but the new world not yet being born, and kind of how we can kind of think through what this means in relationship to the post and the former. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Stop digging.
Thanks. So I don't know, Maria, if you want to start by answering the direct question from Ben.
I don't know whether I directly can make the linkages between the post, the former, and interregnum, but perhaps just a quick introduction to the notion of interregnum, which is a definition by Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebook, so 100 years ago, roughly, I think, somewhere between 1920s and 1930s, definition of crisis as a time of interregnum when the old has died and the new cannot be born. And a number of theorists, among whom Zygmunt Bauman, whom you mentioned a couple of times, who was mentioned a couple of times, actually argued, and Agamben as well, argued that this notion of interregnum could be applied to our time, our own time. And why? And that's an interesting link to the notion of anxiety you introduced. He basically said that under the regime of modernity, we actually could contextualize our existence under the regime of, or under the, within, in the context of the condition of society of risk, as Ulrich Beck, amongst others, articulated. Zygmunt Bauman says that as we moved out of the modern, we actually entered a new era, which is the time of uncertainty. So he doesn't use the term anxiety, but uncertainty. So he talks about uncertainty society. So where this kind of calculation of risk is no longer the case to assure growth, existence, progress, etc., etc. And however negative connotation the notion of anxiety or uncertainty has, it also is a condition which still keeps all options open. We don't know what the outcome is. So he actually re-articulates it into the positive, which is, I think, potentially really interesting. How we get out of the interregnum and out not moving out of it in terms of linear time. We need to envision another sort of movement out of the situation, not from past into the future, as was customary. This is also Latour's argument, by the way, who's also been mentioned a couple of times. But another sort of movement. How do we move out of the notion, out of this period of interregnum, which is a lengthy period, full of morbid symptoms? Depends how we. Depends on how we deal. Depends on how we deal with three key issues. One would be disparity of power and politics, arguing that power and politics are two different separate things. While politics is capacity to think through the solutions, power is the capacity to implement those solutions in life, but those two are not connected. So that's one of the conditions of the contemporary, and the other two are the endurability of the planet and the future of the refugees. So this is how he articulates the notion of a possibility of a survival of the period of interregnum. Now, in the beginning of the project Former West, which was back in 2008, we played with post and former a little bit, but our conclusion or analysis at that time was precisely the opposite of what you propose. We were not articulating the end of the West, but a kind of dehegemonizing of the West in that respect. So we thought, the West is still something, former indicates something that still has power over your imagination, but it can hold that power over your imagination differently than how we got to know it. So that was our analysis at the time. And I mean, the project has been through a number of stages of dealing with this former West thesis in a way, and it's been a complex trajectory. And I'm reminded of our conversation in London a couple of days ago, I think, because we started with the proposition of former West as a as-if scenario. Do as if this was former West. After a heavy critique of a number of speakers and thinkers proposing look out of the window, that you don't see a former West. You see resurgent West that's waging wars that it did not, during the Cold War era, etc., etc. And we shifted from do as if into what if. And that was really an interesting yet complicated move, because speaking of time, we said, okay, so the West after 89 remained itself, just the West, continuing doing as if nothing has happened, and perhaps even more kind of distributing itself across the global condition. But we're proposing for it to become former in the future. There comes additional time complication to imagine that the West should become former in the future. So it's been through a number of mutations and variations of trying to understand the notion of time within the formerness, and it's not easy. I mean, the notion of former West has immense rhetorical power, I think. Even if I would speak to my parent, they immediately know what I talk about, and they think, yes, this is what needs to be done. But yet, when you try to detangle it through artistic practice, curatorial practice, or philosophically, you encounter this kind of trouble. And I think the proposition from our conversation in London last time was we need to return back to as if position, do as if. And it was slightly what to me was resembled in proposition of Catherine Gibson this morning. She says, through all that critique we have in our world, 95% of it actually reproduces the notion of neoliberalism by critiquing it. And only some 5%, if any, is left for propositional thinking out of that critique and for implementing those ideas. But if you take the as-if stand, which I understood Catherine Gibson was proposing, you actually change the ratio between the two. And this is something what I think it's inevitable to adopt in our life. And I know what I have written in the notion of, in the text on the notion of survival irritates many theorists when I say we need to get rid of that critique we know from the modernist regime and shift towards proposition and action from there. And for me, that's the notion of survival. That question, how we rephrase that sort of modernist critique that reproduces the phenomena it critiques, that keeps it in life. And I know the notion of critique has been, theorized up and intensely, and it's really easy to disarm what I'm saying at this very moment. But I think that shift from critique to proposition to action is really what's important at this moment. So it's not, TJ mentioned that in situations of emergency we kind of drop the moment of thinking and start to act without thinking. I think there's a possibility in the moment of emergency to do precisely both. And I think that's how we think about the notion of survival, not survival of the fittest, but reconceptualizing the notion of survival towards how do we survive well, which is the proposition of Catherine Gibson actually in her latest book, given the current circumstances. It goes back to a very basic question: what is to be done in order to be able to survive well in this context?
Hello, I would like to ask Maria. I really don't understand why we why we still use the word survival or survival well instead of using the word living. Because as Marina said before, if you ask me how you want to survive, I'll say black. If you ask me how you want to live, I will say red. So the question brings the right answer. So why we continue have this? Why we formulate our questions how to survive well? This is one question, this is one question for now.
Thank you, Anna. This binds very well to our discussions yesterday, I think.
Yes.
And the day before yesterday, the learning place.
Yes, yes.
Those two questions to me are related. And we read Derrida to answer your question, learning to live finally. And the precondition for that is the possibility to survive.
Okay.
But maybe to add to that, I think this, when it becomes a question of survival, it also indicates a starting point that's defensive, rather than being on the offense. So it means that our starting point, and I think this is certainly my lived experience, I could be wrong, but that's what I feel, that it is a defensive starting point. Because neoliberalism is, in my view, a kind of critique of certain life forms and certain forms of subjectivity, and it is relentless critique. So it's not just an economic regime. I think it's a form of critical theory, form of politics, in that sense, that modulates our very being, and does so 24/7. There I would agree. It does so when we sleep. It does so when we it does so when we procrastinate. It does so when we dream. Yeah, so this is part of the complication. So therefore, it becomes, I think the question is a fairly defensive one. We survive, but it's not enough to survive, because who wants to survive, a nuclear holocaust, let's say, who wants to be the survivor after that? Many films, popular culture, that this is always a kind of moment of depression, the last man, all right, in survival films. It's never, there are always dystopic films. So it's then, I think it becomes, well, okay, to survive well. So we're not even, I think, at the moment where we dare say, this is how we want to live, which I think actually has to do with moment of critique, but that's because I have a Foucauldian point of view. So critique is just to say, I don't want to be governed like this. Yeah, but with neoliberalism, you cannot. That is not an adequate answer for neoliberalism to say I don't want to be governed like this. There's not a discussion. You are governed like this. That's how pervasive it is, I think. So therefore, in my view, that's why survival becomes becomes the metaphor, because it feels like it's about survival first of all, and then maybe surviving well, and then after that we can talk about how to live, I think.
But don't we lose energy from that? Yeah, don't we lose energy from thinking how I can survive when I know that because when we think how we can survive, we start analyzing how to survive and all the aspects around, and then maybe this leaves some other new realities outside, new aspects outside. As you said, how we can, as Maria said, how we can be practical. So, in that aspect, I was wondering
No, in my point of view, I don't disagree with you. I was just trying to explain that that's why I think survival is there. It's definitely a defensive point of view. So you could, of course, adopt a more offensive point of view and say that this is not enough, which I think is what you're implying, and that's possible, and I kind of would probably agree with that politically, in terms of political motivation. So it's also, it's a kind of self-critique of us saying, I think that's why the notion of survival comes up, is because we feel, some of us anyway, that we are in a defensive position.
And for example, the question is, for example, how to survive an institution. I will take this as an example, how to survive an institution. But if we think about new vocabulary, as you had as a course, then maybe in the new vocabulary there is no word as institution. So that is my...
We can register it as a proposition. I disagree.
I'm not saying about institution, but it could be whatever else. Could be we're talking about property, but then it couldn't be. It could be privacy and not property. We are talking about left and right. When in this era maybe there is not point to talk about left and right. When we talk about how to work and how to live, and when there is no point actually to work, because then I go before to the. Sorry. Okay. I have two specific questions. Okay. The one question is. I heard that we cannot simultaneously fight for freedom and environment, and this goes to work. And I want to ask, in which context? Is there freedom when you work mainly for food, but you are apart from the environment, that you don't connect with the environment? And the other question is, we said that there is no option of withdrawal. And I want to ask, what is withdrawal? Is it decentralization? Or is continue to working and trying to fit in this situation?
Does somebody feel talked to when it comes to the notion of freedom? Anna, help me, what was it? Freedom and...
It's freedom, we cannot simultaneously fight for freedom and for environment.
Freedom and environment at the same time?
At the same time.
Okay.
That's good. I think that's you guys.
Ruben, do you want to respond to this? And then TJ, you have a mic.
Thanks for the comment and the question, really. And it is an important question to see how somehow for me what you're saying is kind of hinting at this danger also within ecology, which we haven't really spoken about today. But if you look at history and the history of ecology in the 20th century, also in the 19th century, in the 20th century, it also has taken different directions at times. It's not always been so closely associated with freedom. So there's also a kind of a nationalist branch of ecology, which maybe is concerned with national identity and the celebration of the landscape as a way of emphasizing national identity, up to the Third Reich and the kind of eco-fascism, which is also another tendency which has existed historically within environmentalism, although we don't maybe talk about it that much. So it is important when we're talking about ecology that somehow you can't just consider it. That's why maybe it's important not to just think of ecology just from a purely, say, environmental point of view, without also connecting it to the other registers, as Guattari said, of the environment, i.e. the social and the mental. So if you just concentrate on the environmental, maybe there's a risk of losing out on the freedom aspect. But if you also think about social sustainability and sustainability in terms of mental subjectivities, then freedom is also included in that package somehow.
Okay, I'd like to thank Laura for her response and respond to her response in order to use it as an opportunity to maybe clarify what I was trying to say and possibly correct some potential misunderstandings. Laura, you raised 2 points. One was the slipperiness of indigeneity as something that is unclear about the relation between indigenous knowledge and indigenous practice. So that's one. The second one is becoming indigenous a matter of co-optation. So the first one, I'd like to say that indigeneity is a complex, multivalent term, which isn't the same as characterizing it as slippery. I mean, it is slippery in some ways because it's not easy to articulate, but it's certainly filled with complexity and different historical determinations. So the recent discussions of it, in my experience, in my research, talk about it in relation to nativeness and a form of micro-minority status, but also an increasingly urban and internet-mediated social networked identity. So these are crucial elements of just the complexity of this term. Now, in relation to knowledge versus practice, I wasn't at all trying to suggest such a separation. And in fact, some of the examples that I pointed to, like Idle No More or the Cochabamba meeting, the People's Summit in relationship to the rights of Mother Earth, these are actually not only drawing on forms of traditional knowledge in relationship to the care of the earth or living within a sustainable ecology, but also for models, I think, for advanced potential governmental practice, because these meetings like Cochabamba took place in the shadow of the UN summits around considerations of the environment. Mm-hmm. Generally, these have been systematic failures in relationship to dominant governmental positions on how to deal with climate change. Right. So, in fact, Cochabamba represents a very important resource for how to try to propose a form of democratization, including a diversity of stakeholders in the discussions of how to deal with the threats of anthropogenic climate change. So for me, it has to, the rights of nature is also very much led by indigenous groups and social movements. So again, it's indigeneity in this sense is not any kind of matter of like a ritualistic primitivism. It's an advanced form of modeling of new models of governance, legality, economics around survivability within the context of extinction and climate change. Similarly, Evo Morales in Bolivia. No matter what we think of him, in some ways he's a complex and potentially problematic policymaker in relationship to ecological matters. He's nevertheless an indigenous president of Bolivia, and that's another crucial example of a model of becoming indigenous within mainstream political governance. So that's something else that we could talk to. It's a very complex subject. Obviously, we don't have enough time to deal with all of these subtleties. Is becoming indigenous a matter of co-optation? I don't think so at all. Not in the sense that I was proposing it again after Jim Clifford's recent book. Rather, it's precisely against assimilation and against the history of genocide to which Native peoples, including Amerindians and Native Americans and other indigenous peoples in different places, have been dealing with for centuries. So for me, it's not a matter of co-optation, but a political subjectivization and a process of rejection of a Western and now global model of unsustainable neoliberalism. So this is a very complex mode of becoming when the West and that Western episteme of an unsustainable ecology becomes former. So for me, I don't think it's something that we can give up, and we don't want to let it. We don't want to be scared off by the dangers of the potentials of co-optation. But of course, it's a complex identity formation at the same time.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up question to that, because I was thinking about it as well earlier when you talked about it, and it also kind of stuck out for me, and certainly also in a former-West frame. So to try and understand it a little bit more in terms of mobilization, but also in terms of identity politics, what would it mean to become indigenous in the city where we both work, in London? What does that mean?
I think, in my understanding, it means it's a process of learning how to live in a world in a way that is ecologically sustainable, mixed with a new form of political rights and transnational solidarities. So it means connecting to the resources of a model of, this is, again, a selective definition of what it means. But for me, it has to do with practices of degrowth, of relocalization, of a form of political ecology that is at once about ecological sustainability as well as about social justice and connecting to the history of decolonization struggles. So it's a range of becomings or connections within this form of political subjectivization. So, I'm looking at different models of how this might be practiced, and I thought that within the artistic arena or cultural arena, there are different forms where people are exploring this, and I wanted to bring those to our attention in order to think through what the possibilities are, because there's no simple, obvious answer to what this means. But if Jim Clifford says that we are all indigenous, and that it's a process of becoming, then I think it's something that we should think about, and it's worthwhile to consider.
I just want to respond to that a little bit. I think the idea of the solidarity stance of that, I think, is good, and I think I agree with it, if I can just put it in that terms, rather in contrast to the co-option option which I gave. I think this idea of becoming indigenous is related to the idea of cosmopolitanism, which maybe we can relate a little bit to this idea of this kind of capitalist animist that you discussed before. I think, for example, you gave of living in London. I mean, if we became indigenous to London in the way that we actually live it, not like thinking in this kind of maybe a post sense, in that we're living in the present, which I don't think my experience of living in London is particularly connected to. Well, of course it is in lots of senses, but it's very much a present, contemporary, capitalist animist realm, if I was going to think of it in an indigenous sense. So I think the confusion I had was with this becoming indigenous. I could perhaps think through how to utilise the circumstances of living in a major capital, and kind of thinking in a capitalist animist sense there. But then as far as becoming indigenous, that's where I find it problematic. I was thinking of, I had an exhibition a couple of years ago, Crisis Complex, and we hosted a symposium to discuss an Aboriginal passport ceremony that had been held a couple of weeks before. And this Aboriginal passport was so that, it was symbolic, of course, but that people who immigrated to Australia could surpass the white colonial governance system and taking of sovereignty, and directly pass from Aboriginal country to country and use that passport to recognise those borders. And I think if we're using the words becoming indigenous, I think if people want, I think the indigenous of a colonial country might not want the colonising powers to become indigenous. They have their own culture that is theirs, and they don't. That's where the confusion about subsuming and co-option came for me. If that makes. sense.
I see that danger, but also I was also responding to like the movement Idle No More and their welcoming of a joining in solidarity, and that was, you know, that's coming from people who are threatened in many ways with a form of enforced extinction. And so it's not something that is an imagined point of an exoticized identification, but rather a joining in a political invitation to join into a form of solidarity. And I think that that's really important, and it's a really significant political movement in the Americas that's transnational, and also isn't just a matter of people who would identify as indigenous in that sense. So I think it avoids that danger of co-option. It's not about capitalist animism either, right? It's directly against neoliberal capitalism in terms of its political formation.
Sure.
Yeah, to Ben, I just wanted to send thanks to Ben, what he said. Today it was sort of humanist Marxist critique. Yesterday it was sort of post-humanist critique, sort of very. But I mean that. Thanks for a comment. But I think that I don't buy this idea of plural temporalities, and it's of course you can say positive, but it's a very metaphorical way. Like I don't know. This again, this nostalgic mode. Like before was something slow, nice, and so on. But generally, structurally, I mean, because I draw on a very long, consistent tradition of philosophical and theoretical analysis of capitalism, and relating to contemporary debates which around this, what actually after this intoxication with posts, which really paralyzing. I agree. So I mean that it's quite consistent theoretical statement. Sorry, and starting from some key moments in Marx and then in Benjamin, whatever. But anyway, I think that generally you mentioned about anxiety. I think it's quite interesting point but at the same time, you know this about this distinction of fear and anxiety, is classical distinction in psychoanalysis and many things. And actually, I think it's actually this no time temporality. It's actually very closely connected. I agree with this distinction because, for example, when you have sort of anxious procrastination, getting some very dubious pleasure from doing nothing, but at the same time feeling guilty, but it's exactly a description of anxiety. But when you are facing a deadline, it's a fear, of course. I mean, and also I would like to reflect a little bit, just a very few words about this. What Maria actually said about interregnum. I mean, it's interesting that both in Gramscian version and both in Zygmunt Bauman was interesting, saying distinguishing this power and politics and so on. But I think it's interesting to think from the point of this historical roots of this concept, actually, which also based on political-theological thinking of medieval ages, because interregnum is a time of interruption of power, when a monarch dies or when he falls asleep, actually, also a very big problem for theological thinking. So it's a moment when power is somehow, there is no center of power. There is, so it's also could be, interestingly reflected to what happens now, because, that it's presupposed that now we are in a sort of rapture, but I would say it's paradoxical rupture is still based on this pressure of continuity. So it's very interesting condition. So of course we are in the point of rupture in terms of we have no consistent clear vision of future, of history, and we have in this moment when old is not over and new is not born, and so on and so on and so on. But generally at the same time this big symbolic gap or this hole which we are now experiencing also penetrated by many mechanisms of which support this continuity. So it's very interesting constellation, I agree.
Any reaction?
I feel compelled to continue our debate on indigeneity based on my 4 years of fieldwork in Brazil, and which included also some kind of connection with various social movements, including landless movement and some indigenous movement. And the first thing is that Evo Morales is bought completely into carbon trade and is selling trees to global companies in exchange of credits. The second thing is in 1970 there was a discussion about hunter and gatherers in cities, and it was within anthropology. And the question was, are hunter and gatherers still hunter and gatherers even if they live in cities, don't have any economy of self-sufficiency? In other terms, can hunter and gathering be in some kind of consciousness that exists outside a realm of livelihood, which is sort of dictated by direct access to resources and things that hunter and gatherer would do. And there was also an interesting debate about the so-called justice and ecological consciousness or ecological practices of hunter and gatherer societies. And it turns out that basically many hunter and gatherer society did deforestation, overkilled, especially in terms of, especially the case of seals in the Arctic. They didn't have any welfare state. In other terms, there was no protection of women and child. And so there was a total idealization of these societies created by the West. The other thing, it was very difficult to actually assess the impact of hunter-gatherer society because there were small communities. And so basically, there was no way of assessing the bigger impact of small communities. And that's what I was mentioning yesterday, the kind of danger of primitivism. And of course, I do take your points about this the importance of how these new rural movements are connecting with new different kind of social movements, especially in the Americas, which is very important. And I want to finish with the work of Claude Andujar, who is a photographer who done fantastic photos between the Yanomami in Mexico. And she was Romanian, Jewish Romanian, whose family was killed entirely in the Holocaust. And she moved to Brazil, and she spent 20 years defending the rights of the Yanomami. And she did fantastic photos, but the photos she made was for a medical expedition in which all the Yanomami were classified according to photos. And so the genealogy was totally reconstructed to photos. And she was haunted by this project. Because in order to follow this kind of Western project of resurrecting the Yanomami, she basically completely marked them, and that's the title of exhibition that she presented 3 years ago in São Paulo. It was called Marcados, which means marked, and how she was dealing with the trauma of marking Yanomami through the eyes and the sort of art of a Western audience.
Thanks for that complication around the discourse of indigeneity. I would agree with you. I don't have any disagreement there. I think that all your qualifications are really important. And again, this is I suppose I would want to stress in response just this notion of indigeneity that I'm trying to point to. Is something that is inseparable from its representation, which is ongoing and unfinished, and in some ways contradictory, I suppose, in the sense that you're bringing to it. But it remains to be invented and constructed in a way that draws on what resources that exist in terms of putting together a project of a kind of political, social, ecological, economic sustainability. And I think it's being done in certain articulations. Some of the ones that I pointed to are ones that I'm very interested in and feel a sense of solidarity with. But I recognize what you're pointing out as well, and I wouldn't want to propose any kind of generic or reductive or homogenizing category of what it means to be indigenous. Yeah. Thanks for the response.
Maya, you want to react?
Just a little reference to what you were saying about the societies and the relation to the environment in terms of exploitation of the environment. And when it was when we were thinking of why did this civilization disappear from the earth, and the collapse of these civilizations, it's always been it has been pointed out that for many reasons it was precisely their attitude to the environment. and for their unsustainable lifestyles. And what is the situation today is that we're facing this collapse. And it's not just these isolated communities anymore, but it's really on the global scale. So this brings us again to the idea of collapse.
And it's for you, Maria, actually, and for everyone. But again, I must say, it's a provocative question, and I don't think it's a question to be answered at this moment. Yeah, it's sort of a rhetorical question. I mean, it's a real question, but I think it takes much more time than just an answer. You talked about that we are here about, we are discussing about becoming former in the future. You just said, we are here to discuss how to become former in the future. And my question is, and again, it's a provocative question, is this former West? And the reason why I'm asking this is because, as you know, I used to work in finance for so many years, and this scarily looks like a BBVA seminar. BBVA is a Spanish bank I work for. It doesn't look like a Merrill Lynch one, because that's much grander and much more informal, but it does look like, that kind of things. So, my question is, shouldn't we also address the how and not only the subject? Because we are addressing a lot the subjects, but maybe we should also take care of the hows. And I finish with this. Shouldn't we do next Former West meeting in a bar?
Well, as a matter of fact, there are drinks next door that I would suggest that we take pleasure in now and continue the discussion there. So
with some additional air.
Thanks everyone for your contributions and for being here. It was really wonderful. Thanks a lot.